Moving on in the conversation about state strategies to reduce poverty, Chris Haney, Executive Director of the California Budget Project.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all this afternoon about a state earned income tax credit in particular and how it could help the state reduce economic hardship and poverty levels. It's important to start by understanding why these programs and policies are needed, in particular in EITC, and why we need strategies to reduce economic hardship more broadly. Would start by sort of backing up into an issue where the economic security of low and middle income Californian has eroded over the past generation. The handout you're about to receive shortly has two charts in it that illustrate this point. I'll talk about just one piece of that, which is if you look at changes in adjusted gross income going back into the late 1980s and adjusted for inflation in the state, what you find is that for the top fifth of earners, the top 20% in the state, you see an increase in their earnings of 45%. And if you look at just the top 1%, you see, adjusted for inflation, an increase in their earnings of 126%. All other groups, all other quintiles, the rest of the other 80% of the state have seen their incomes, when you adjust for inflation, erode over that same period of time. And so I highlight that point just to illustrate that economic hardship has been increasing prior to the recession and then was exacerbated by the effects of the recession and the slow recovery as we've come out of it. And so a refundable state EITC like that, which you've just been hearing about, and like those enacted in 26 other states, would reduce economic hardship, would help in this regard. And it would help in a number of ways. By starting, it allows low and middle income working families to keep more of their earnings. It rewards work and allows them to keep more from that work. Nearly 70% of families living in poverty in California had at least one working adult as of 2013. So an EITC would let those folks keep more of their earnings. An EITC would also help the state rebalance its state and local tax system, which currently asks low-income households to pay a larger share of their income in taxes than higher-income families. If you add up state and local taxes combined and you look at fifths of the population, what you'll see is that the bottom fifth of the earnings distribution is paying the largest share of its income in state and local taxes at 10.6%. And if we took a traditionally structured EITC, a 15% federal piggyback EITC, just as for instance, it would reduce that burden on them from 10.6 to 9.6%, and it would even the system out a little bit, a bit more over time. The average tax cut from this type of an EITC would be $321, for instance, for someone in the bottom fifth of the population. That's folks earning less than $21,000 a year. It would be about $400 for the second fifth, those earning between $21,000 and $36,000. And using this structure, $257 for the middle fifth in the $36,000 to $57,000 range. And obviously, if we looked at other alternatives in terms of structure, those numbers would change. But that's just to give you a sense of how the numbers play out. Another key element of the EITC is that it complements other state policies, such as an increase in California's minimum wage, like that which we've put in place earlier. A state EITC can reach different populations in economic need. For instance, if you take a single parent who earns slightly above the minimum wage but cannot work full-time because of a lack of child care, and they receive an EITC, you give them a significant benefit in terms of their earnings and their well-being. A state EITC is timed differently. It arrives essentially in one chunk as an annual benefit that can be used for larger one-time expenses, and research shows it's typically used for things like car repairs and deposits on security deposits on housing, educational expenses, et cetera. And a state EITC also increases the effectiveness of the minimum wage, and that it allows the folks who are earning that wage to actually keep more of their earnings. So there's a variety of ways that an EITC works well with other programs, and including the CalWorks programs and some of the other programs that will be talked about here today. So there are a number of other additional considerations to take into account. First, as was noted by Mr. Woolsey, a non-refundable EITC would reach very few Californians. If you take a refundable EITC like the one I've mentioned earlier, it would reach 43% of taxpayers earning less than $21,000. It would reach 36% of taxpayers between $21,000 and $36,000. A non-refundable EITC in comparison would reach just 0.2% and 1.2% of those same groups. So dramatically different impact in terms of the reach of what it might do. And of course, other issues to consider: the size and reach of the credit has been mentioned, the simplicity of administering the credit and of claiming the credit, and then there are all the alternative design options like the childless workers, increasing their benefit levels, targeting it to families with low-income children, families with young children, or some combination of those, as Mr. Woolsey has mentioned. But the key issue that we want to leave you this is that regardless of how it's targeted or structured, a refundable EITC that has the potential to significantly increase the well-being of a large number of Californians, increasing earnings and family income, helping them ease the cost of necessities like housing, health care, and child care, and working in tandem with other policies, a state EITC becomes a fundamental necessary component of a sustained policy response to economic hardship in California. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Haney. Now we'll hear from Michelle Stilwell-Parvensky, who is Senior Policy and Communications Associate at the Children's Defense Fund, California. Good to see you again.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Stoll-Barbensky, Children's Defense Fund, California. I want to thank the subcommittee for having this critical forward-thinking panel on how we can reduce child poverty and poverty, and for your continued dedication to looking at the issues of the devastating impact that child poverty has on children and families. Child poverty is a moral and economic crisis in our state. More than 1 in 4 California children live in poverty, 2.2 million children, and more than 1 in 3 African American and 1 in 3 Latino children in our state live in poverty. As Director Lightbourne mentioned, growing up poor negatively impacts the entire trajectory of a child's life. Child poverty creates gaps in cognitive skills that we can see as early as 9 months old, and those gaps continue to grow as children age. Extreme poverty can also produce toxic stress that literally rewires a child's brain and can affect the functioning of their brain for life. Child poverty jeopardizes children's health and their ability to learn. All of those disadvantages of poverty compound and produce lifetime negative consequences. We know that children who are born in poverty or grow up poor are less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to find a well-paying job, more likely to have poor health, and more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. Ultimately, child poverty fuels an intergenerational cycle of poverty because poor children are more likely to grow up to be poor adults and parents. Furthermore, we can't afford child poverty and its substantial economic costs. Research shows that child poverty costs the nation an estimated $500 billion a year in terms of lost productivity and earnings and increased health care and crime costs. Letting a quarter of our children grow up poor prevents them from having the equal opportunities to succeed and also robs our state and our nation of their future contributions. But we know what to do on child poverty. Child poverty is a solvable problem. Based on analysis from the nonprofit Urban Institute, the Children's Defense Fund came out with a new report, Ending Child Poverty Now, that found that the nation could reduce child poverty by 60% and lift 6.6 million children out of poverty, including 1.3 million California children, by investing 2% of the federal budget in expanding existing federal programs that work. At the state level, California can significantly reduce child poverty by investing in effective state programs and policies. A bold vision to end child poverty in California involves a combination of strategies and programs that we know work. We know that our current social safety net is already playing a critical role in reducing child poverty. New data released today from the Annie Casey Foundation finds that without government interventions, 40% of California children would be poor. So if not for those investments in the federal EITC, the child tax credit, CalFresh, housing subsidies, and other programs, nearly 1.3 million more children in California would live in poverty. These data underscore how effective government interventions can be in reducing child poverty, but clearly we're not doing enough, and California's safety net is stretched too thin, and well-paying jobs are too rare to protect all children from poverty. I've passed out our report that includes 8 recommendations on how California can reduce child poverty right now. I know that we're running a little short on time, so I will just touch on them briefly and would be happy to follow up with more information. One, enact a refundable state earned income tax credit. I would echo my fellow panelists on the benefits of a state EITC as one of the most effective tools for reducing child poverty. Two, raise the minimum wage to bring working poor families out of poverty and closer to self-sufficiency. Three, expand the number of child care slots for low-income children. Making child care affordable to families reduces child poverty by enabling parents to work and increasing their economic security. High-quality child care also breaks the cycle of poverty in the long run by fostering children's brain development and enabling future economic and academic success. Four, restoring the refundability of the state tax credit for child-independent care expenses, which helps families pay for child care. The state credit was originally refundable, which meant that low-income families who didn't have tax liability were able to benefit. Unfortunately, in 2011, due to budget cuts, we eliminated the refundability of that credit, meaning that the families and children who need it most are unable to benefit. Five, protect children from extreme poverty by increasing CalWORK's benefits and eliminating the maximum family grant rule. CalWORK's grant levels are below the deep poverty threshold of 1/2 the federal poverty line. Furthermore, the maximum family grant rule in CalWORKs denies additional basic needs assistance for children who are born to a family who is already receiving aid. This MFG rule pushes families deeper into poverty at the most developmentally critical time of a newborn baby. Six, fund transportation for low-income children so they're able to promote children's regular attendance and success in school and increase their access to public resources. Seven, reduce child hunger by increasing participation in CalFresh, which is particularly important here in California, given that we have one of the lowest participation rates in the nation. And finally, 8, invest in affordable housing by providing dedicated resources to develop rental housing that is affordable to extremely low-income families, dealing with the housing instability point that was brought up earlier. California cannot afford to continue allowing 1 in 4 children to grow up in poverty, harming their health and well-being and undermining their future academic and economic success. The research and the statistics clearly demonstrate the importance of reducing poverty, but the real reason why we must take action is to protect all of the California children who are hungry or homeless or hopeless about their future. So that's children like Zachary, who's a CDF Beat the Odds honoree from South LA, who feels the weight of having to provide for his family so they won't need to sleep in their car again. It's children like Brianna, who's a CDF Freedom School scholar from Long Beach, who shares a small, overcrowded home with 10 family members and sometimes can't afford a bus pass to get to school. It's children like Liz from Los Angeles, who shares what it's like to go to bed hungry, stomach growling, unable to sleep, waiting for a new day. Let us make a new, brighter day for poor children in California. The solutions to child poverty in California already exist if we are willing to invest in them. If we can build the political will together to end child poverty, we can ensure that all California children have the opportunity to meet their full potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stillwell-Pvrty. Thank you very much. Mr. Lightbourne, we're going to get into the Q&A in a second, but did you have anything else before we do that? Okay, very good. We have a wonderful opportunity. I'm honored that our colleague, Assemblymember Stone, is here, who has been giving great thought to this very conversation, our strategies for how to help our California families get out of poverty. We'd like to have him come forward at this time to give us a few words about his thoughts on how we might move forward. Welcome, Assemblymember Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and subcommittee. It's an honor to be able to present to you today and with this group here. And in listening to the testimony and the work that we have looked at over the last couple of years trying to address the issue of poverty, I think one thing that stands out is the amount of conversation we have had, but very little action. And with your committee and as we have had conversations, this House has the opportunity this year to provide some real leadership on the issue of bringing people out of poverty. You've heard the statistics. And by any of the measures, poverty in California, the numbers of Californians living in poverty is startling. striking. The lowest in the federal poverty measure of 17%, which does not come close to accounting for what poverty really represents in California. Look at it through the supplemental poverty measure, the California poverty measure, and full 25% of Californians truly are struggling. We've heard testimony and we know about the recovery in California, but that recovery is not reaching broadly enough nor deeply enough in many of our communities. And I think our opportunity is to provide some strategies that not only address the poverty issue, real tools to address the poverty issue here, but also provide some real economic stimulus in the communities that have been left behind by any of the recovery that's happened in California. The numbers we're talking about, millions of people in California, and even an earned income tax credit. I'm not here today to pitch AB 43, which is a policy bill so that we can have the policy conversation around an earned income tax credit. But that approach, and there are a number of different options that are presented there and that are presented in the options today that can be mixed and matched appropriately depending on what we as a body decide our priorities are going to be in concert with the administration and all of the advocates throughout California, looking at where we want to address, but how we want to address it. And it's a complicated and expensive proposal. And I know that our House is looking at EITC, looking at addressing the maximum family grant, which is just an arbitrary number that is very, very detrimental to our poorest of families and, most importantly, to the children of California, as well as addressing the minimum wage. There are strategies that need to work together, but they're expensive. And that is what your committee, I know, is addressing it. We're trying to do in the legislature and the Assembly this year in our budget priorities for going to the table with the governor and with the Senate. And I hope that the questions that we're asking and the conversation that we're having is to ask ourselves, can we afford to not put some of these investments in place that will help lift the poorest of Californians out of poverty, that will help even for those that we can't lift out of poverty, but close some of those gaps that they're having, take the stresses out of the family. The statistics around the federal EITC show that those families are using those monies to alleviate some of the stresses, address their housing concerns, address other gaps that they have, including educational gaps. And if we're going to truly close the educational gaps that exist in our system, if we're going to truly shift that pipeline of sending kids in our poorest communities ultimately to very, very expensive and detrimental outcomes like prison, like the child welfare system, if we're going to be reducing domestic violence and child abuse in our communities by removing some of those stresses, we have to be looking at a lot of the strategies here, including an earned income tax credit, as a true investment in California and in Californians, and in a way that runs as deep and broadly as we possibly can, so all Californians have an opportunity to share in the benefit of our recovery. So I know your time is limited and you want to get to the other speakers here. I appreciate being able to weigh in, and I appreciate the conversations we have had and will continue to have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Stone. Thank you for your eloquent remarks and framing. I know you didn't come here to talk about AB 43, but thank you for adding emphasis to the conversation about the need for an earned income tax credit and the need for programs to help lift our families out of California. We appreciate your remarks and your advocacy. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We'd like to open up for questions from the committee to the panel. Mr. Bonta, anything?
Thank you. I just want to, before my colleague Mr. Stone leaves, just want to thank you and applaud you for your leadership on the state EITC. Thank you for being bold this year and helping lead our House in this direction. And I'm proud to be a co-author of the bill that we're not promoting today. So thank you. I had a couple questions. The first one is on the state tax credit for child and dependent care expenses. If that were to be made refundable, what would the total cost to the state be? And I guess that's measured in foregone state personal income tax revenue.
Yes. I don't have the complete number, but we know from looking at where we were before the credit was, the refundability of the credit was eliminated, that there was about $110 million in tax benefits for families earning less than $50,000 a year that they're no longer receiving because the credit is not refundable. But we can certainly get those numbers to you.
Great, thank you. Now, turning to the state EITC, I have a couple questions for LAO, some clarifications. On the option 1, which would be the most robust option, the most, I guess, expensive option, the estimate is that it would be roughly $1 billion in lost revenue for that option. Now, if you take a more holistic, more comprehensive approach, are there set-offs that you can actually place against that cost in terms of savings to the state as we're lifting people out of poverty and encouraging work? Are we actually saving on any programs that are provided to our poorest Californians?
Sure. Many programs that involve cash transfer or that involve to improve the situation of low-income Californians that participate in a variety of programs can have offsetting savings. It can be very difficult to ascertain the magnitude of those savings. That's something that can be looked at. We don't have any estimate at this point of what it would be, but in all likelihood, it would be fairly limited relative to the overall cost of the program.
Okay. I've been doing a little bit of thinking about the EITC and I spent some time talking to some leaders in the city of New York, in Mayor de Blasio's office, and they in New York they have the federal EITC, of course, which applies to all states. They have their own state EITC, and they have a city EITC. And one of the things that was shared with me is that for likely eligible individuals, they send them pre-populated tax returns that they need to review for accuracy and then send in. And then they'll get the EITC, which I understand to be refundable. And we, as your last data point on page 11 states, as of 2010, the Internal Revenue Service estimates that only 71% of California tax filers who actually qualified for the federal EITC claimed it. So 2 questions. One, at no cost to the state or no cost in foregone personal income tax revenue, maybe some administrative costs, is there a way to get those numbers up by assisting those who are eligible to qualify to apply for and receive their federal EITC? That's question 1. And then question 2 is, would actually having a state EITC raise those numbers up by making the benefit more attractive and having more persons participate in both the federal EITC and the state EITC?
Sure. On the first question, I'm afraid I might not be qualified to completely answer on that. I'm aware that there have been initiatives in different areas in the country to do things related to easy file and pre-populating those types of forms. And if you'd be interested, I could certainly get in touch with our tax subject matter experts at the LAO, and we can look into that. On the second question, absolutely. I think it's very reasonable to expect that if the state were to enact a refundable earned income tax credit, or really any kind of earned income tax credit, that would raise the profile of the federal credit and likely result in higher participation.
Okay, and I just invite any of the other panelists who have opinions on this to share their thoughts.
Yeah, so this isn't a rocket science in terms of how you would implement it. It's really a question of administrative costs, right? 26 other states are doing it. Your own example of the city of New York and a way that they're innovating with their program suggests that how we implement it and the sort of administrative costs, which overall are relatively minor, as the LAO report shows, would be worth it in the sort of sense of if we want the uptake rate to be higher, then we put a little bit more into the administrative costs to ensure that the outreach to the eligible community is such that that rate does go up. right? So it's really a choice inside the structure of what you would do with an EITC, but there are certainly models and options out there that would help increase the rate from 71%, which we're getting on the federal EITC with relatively little effort in terms of what we're doing as a state and outreach.
In terms of some of the increased administrative costs for better, more effective outreach, is California doing? Are we sort of state of the art with respect to what other states are doing, or are we lagging behind? Do we have a comparative sense of how we measure up with other states? I mean, if there's a standard approach to outreach to sort of bump these participation rates up for the federal EITC, and most states are doing it, but we're not. I have to ask the question of whether that isn't something that we should consider doing at a relatively low cost.
Sure. I can comment just a little bit on that. In the process of preparing our report, we did look at what different states do in terms of outreach, and the information that we came across didn't definitively say whether one state is doing more or less than another, but had just a myriad of different outreach strategies. And interestingly, some of the strategies that were highlighted were done in California at a variety of governmental levels, sometimes counties, sometimes cities. The city and county of San Francisco has an earned income tax credit that's available on a one-time basis, which is designed specifically to raise awareness of the federal credit. So there are a lot of things that we've done. Director Lightbourne might be able to comment on some of the laws that we've passed in recent years that require state agencies to make recipients of public assistance aware of the credit. There are also laws that require employers to notify employees that they might be eligible for the credit. So a lot of efforts have been made, and it should be noted also that the 2010 estimate, while not very old, is still a few years in the past, and unfortunately we don't have a more up-to-date figure at this time.
Thank you.
Would you just say a word? Maybe Mr. Haney, you were talking a little bit about administration of the earned income tax credit. What does really good outreach look like? Because I know that there are great campaigns, Earn It, Keep It campaign, and all these other campaigns. But how do we really make it so that it's effective? Because I can imagine that even with these great campaigns, there's still barriers, and we don't want families to miss out on something that is a help to them. What does our outreach need to look like? What's good outreach?
Well, I think one of the things we have to acknowledge first is that outreach in California probably has some more significant challenges than it does in some of the other states, just by function of geography, size, the size of the population we'd be trying to serve. So, there's some realities about that. But if we invested administratively in the outreach that some of the more innovative programs have done. The sort of pre-populated tax form is a very good example of that, such that you take the federal information that's available and you make it easier for people to file. And then some of the sort of community-based outreach that happens connected with some of our other state programs so that you ensure that the things are working together in tandem. You can increase the uptake rate. I mean, and one of the things we need to remember here is that 71% isn't a bad rate, right? In the grand scheme of tax credits and uptake of tax credits across the country, that's a pretty good rate for not a lot of outreach investment at this point. So the more we do in this regard, the more we're likely to push the rate up and impact the lives and well-being of more of the folks we're trying to reach in California.
Have any states ever just pursued providing it as a credit, not as a tax credit? And I know that we're trying to incentivize work and other things, but have any states just come at it and said, you're living in deep poverty, you're eligible for this, we want to help you, we don't want to make it so damn hard? Mm-hmm. Have any states ever approached it in that way?
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question, because it is a tax credit?
I'm saying as a credit, not as something tied to your tax return, that as a guaranteed credit, if you fall in deep poverty, that you would be eligible, and this would be your credit. We'd say, Mr. Haney, we're proud to have you in our citizenry. We know that you're on hard times. This is yours. Enjoy it. Spend it in our local economy.
Where do I sign up? So I don't know the answer to that, but we can dig into that and get you the answer. So
I'm just saying, not just as someone who's also an author of the bill that we're not talking about for an earned income tax credit. But as someone who understands that sometimes there are other barriers that come with even just filing, even if the form is pre-populated, and not wanting families to have to jump through hoops and that's not directed to anybody here, but I want to know what else is out there. How do we get the money in the hands of the folks who need it?
There is the reality here, and Mr. Lightbourne mentioned this at the beginning of his remarks, is if you really want broad impact and you want to reach a lot of people, you have really sort of two categories of choices: a tax credit or sort of a cash payment program. And there are efficiencies and strengths to both. But what we're talking about here, both of the options we're talking about here fit into those categories.